My name is Clara Hayes, and I am an architect. I don't just design buildings, I commune with them. I understand that a house is more than wood and stone. It is a vessel for memory, a silent witness to the generations it shelters. Our family home, a sprawling stone mansion known as the Willows, was the heart of my world. Built in 1912 by my great-grandfather, its thick walls held the echoes of a century of Hayes family history. The laughter from my mother's garden parties, the scent of my father's pipe tobacco in the library, my own childhood footsteps on the grand, curving staircase. I had dedicated my career to preserving such historic treasures, and I had always believed that one day I would be the custodian of my own. That all changed when my mother, Eleanor, passed away. The grief hollowed out my father, Richard Hayes, leaving a void that was all too quickly filled by Valerie. She was a woman half his age, with a smile as bright and hard as a diamond, and an ambition to match. I watched, helpless, as her influence over him grew. She redecorated the house in a gaudy, modern style that was an insult to its historic character, and she began the systematic, insidious process of pushing me away. My weekly dinners with my father became tense, awkward affairs, with Valerie acting as a smiling gatekeeper. My professional advice on preserving the home's integrity was twisted into accusations of me being controlling. My concern for my father's dwindling health was reframed as a ghoulish preoccupation with his finances. "She's just worried you'll spend her inheritance, darling," I once overheard her whisper to him after I'd questioned an extravagant purchase. In his illness and grief, my father clung to Valerie's vibrant, cloying affection, and he began to see me through her poisoned lens. When he passed, her victory was absolute. The will reading was a brief, brutal affair. My father's entire estate, the multi-million-dollar art collection, the considerable stock portfolio, and the Willows itself, was left to my beloved wife, Valerie. My inheritance was a single, cruel line. To my daughter, Clara, I bequeathed the box of sentimental items from her mother's study, in the hopes that she may reflect on the value of true family loyalty. I was given 48 hours to vacate the property, forever. The next 2 days were a numb, surreal nightmare. I moved through the halls of my own home like a ghost, while Valerie directed movers and decorators with a triumphant gleam in her eye. I focused my energy on packing the contents of my mother's study, a small, sunlit room that Valerie had never touched. It was the only corner of the house that still felt like ours. I carefully wrapped my mother's porcelain tea set, boxed her collection of classic literature, and finally came to the old wooden chest where she kept her most important documents. Numbly, I sorted through old letters and photographs, my fingers brushing against a thick, folded piece of vellum at the bottom. It was the original deed to the property, dated 1912. As an architect, I have a reverence for such documents, the blueprints of history. I carefully unfolded the fragile paper, admiring the elegant calligraphy, my professional instincts a brief respite from the overwhelming grief. I scanned the dense legal text, and then my heart stopped. There, in a section of archaic, ironclad legal language, was a clause I had only ever read about in textbooks. It was titled the Hayes Bloodline Covenant. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that the property and its immediate grounds could only be passed to a direct, blood descendant of the original owner, my great-grandfather. Any transfer of title to a non-blood relative, such as a spouse through a will, would be rendered null and void if a direct, living heir chose to contest it. It was a legal relic, a dusty piece of dynastic ambition from a bygone era. But as far as I knew, it had never been legally challenged or removed from the title. Valerie thought she had inherited a mansion, but what my father had actually left her was a lawsuit. The 48 hours expired like a death sentence. I drove away from the Willows with a single carload of my mother's things and a century-old deed that felt as heavy as a gravestone in my lap. Valerie hadn't even had the decency to see me off. She was too busy consulting with a landscape architect about installing a tennis court over my mother's prize-winning irises. That final, petty cruelty solidified my resolve. My grief was now accompanied by a cold, clear purpose. The next morning, I was not in my new, sterile apartment, but in the mahogany-paneled office of Julian Croft, a former professor of mine who was now the city's foremost expert on historic property law. He was a man who loved legal precedent the way I loved architectural integrity. I laid the deed on his desk. He adjusted his spectacles, his expert eyes scanning the document. He spent a long time on the Bloodline Co. Venant, a low whistle escaping his lips. "My goodness," he murmured, his voice a reverent whisper. "This is a rare bird, a true ironclad covenant. Most of these were dissolved in the mid-20th century, but this one," he trailed off, already cross-referencing city records on his computer. "It's still attached to the title, never been nullified." "Is it enforceable?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Julian leaned back, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Clara, in the world of historic preservation, covenants like this are the legal equivalent of a sacred text. They were designed to protect a family's legacy from precisely this kind of situation. A judge, particularly a judge who respects the sanctity of our city's architectural heritage, will have to take this very seriously. Valerie's claim to the house is standing on a legal sinkhole. The plan we formulated was not one of emotional confrontation, but of precise legal demolition. We filed a lawsuit to contest the portion of the will transferring ownership of the Willows, citing the precedents of the original deeds covenant. The lawsuit was a quiet, formal affair, a volley of paper and precedent. A summons was served to Valerie at the mansion. I imagine she laughed it off, seeing it as the pathetic, desperate act of a disinherited daughter. She would soon learn that I was not fighting with emotion, but with history, and history was on my side. While the lawyers exchanged motions and filings, Valerie began her reign of terror on the house. Friends who still lived in the old neighborhood would call me with horrified updates. She had ripped out the original, hand-carved mahogany banister of the grand staircase, replacing it with a monstrosity of glass and chrome. She had painted over the intricate, hand-painted murals in the dining room with a flat, fashionable shade of greige. She was spending a fortune, tearing the soul out of the house, transforming it into a monument to her own vapid, modern taste. Each report was a fresh stab of pain, but it also fueled my fight. This was no longer just about a home, it was about rescue. It was a mission to save the Willows from the clutches of a woman who could never understand its value. I was not just fighting for myself, I was fighting for my great-grandfather, for my mother, for the very spirit of the house itself. The legal process was a slow, agonizing crawl, a stark contrast to the rapid destruction Valerie was inflicting upon the Willows. Her legal team was aggressive, a high-priced firm that specialized in contentious estate battles. Their primary argument was that the Bloodline Covenant was an archaic, unenforceable relic, a piece of legal history that had no place in the 21st century. They painted me as a bitter, resentful daughter, trying to use a dusty loophole to subvert my father's clear final wishes. Julian Croft, my lawyer, was my rock. He countered their arguments with a quiet, unshakable confidence. He built our case not on emotion, but on the steadfast principle of preservation. We compiled a mountain of evidence. The mansion's official designation as a Class A historic landmark, the meticulous records of my family's century-long stewardship of the property, and my own professional credentials as an architect specializing in historic buildings. Julian's masterstroke was to bring in an expert witness, a renowned legal historian from the State University. On the stand, she eloquently explained that covenants like the one on our deed were often put in place specifically to ensure a property of significant architectural or historical value remained with the family who understood its unique character, protecting it from being sold off or destroyed by a future, less invested owner. The covenant, she argued, is not just about bloodline, it's about the preservation of a cultural asset. As part of the discovery process, Julian arranged for a court-sanctioned inspection of the property. I was allowed to accompany him. Walking through the front doors of my home after months away was a disorienting, painful experience. The house was a chaotic construction zone, the air thick with the dust of demolition. I saw the ghost of the mahogany banister, its elegant curve now replaced by the harsh, sterile lines of Valerie's new installation. In the dining room, I reached out and touched the wall, the thick, modern paint feeling like a suffocating shroud over the delicate murals I knew were still underneath. It was a desecration. Valerie was there, of course, trailing us with her lawyer, her expression a mask of smug ownership. "Big improvement, don't you think?" she said to me, gesturing at the ruined dining room. "It was all so dark and old-fashioned before." I didn't answer her. I simply documented the changes with my phone's camera. my architect's eye noting every violation of the home's historic integrity. The images were entered into evidence, a visual testament to the fact that Valerie was not a steward, but a destroyer. She saw the mansion not as a legacy to be protected, but as a stage for her own vanity. This visual evidence, Julian later told me, was a turning point. It gave a face to the abstract legal argument. We were no longer just fighting over a clause. We were fighting to save a masterpiece from a vandal. The judge, an old-school traditionalist named Judge Alastair Finch, looked at the photographs of the chrome banister with an expression of profound, personal offense. In that moment, I felt a flicker of hope. I was fighting for the soul of my home, and I finally had an ally who understood the language it spoke. The day of the final ruling arrived on a crisp autumn morning. The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. I sat beside Julian, my hands clenched in my lap. Valerie was on the opposite side of the aisle, dressed in a flamboyant designer suit, looking more inconvenienced than concerned. She still believed her money and her high-powered lawyers would prevail. She had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the battle she was in. Judge Finch entered the room, and a hush fell. He was a formidable presence, a man who seemed to carry the weight of the law in the set of his shoulders. He wasted no time with pleasantries. He summarized the arguments from both sides with a brisk, impartial efficiency. Then he paused, looking over his spectacles, first at Valerie's legal team and then at me. "The will of Richard Hayes is clear in its emotional intent," he began, and my heart sank. He clearly wished for his wife, Valerie Hayes, to be the beneficiary of his estate. He paused again. "However, the law is not solely concerned with emotional intent. It is concerned with legal precedent, with contracts, and with the binding agreements that form the bedrock of property ownership." He picked up a copy of the 1912 deed. "This document, and the bloodline covenant contained within it, is such an agreement. It is an unbroken, undissolved legal contract that predates the will by nearly a century. The defense has argued that this covenant is archaic, and it is. They have argued that it is out of step with modern sensibilities, and it is, but they have failed to argue that it is illegal or unenforceable." My breath caught in my throat. "This court," Judge Finch continued, his voice resonating with authority, "recognizes the unique status of historically designated properties. The purpose of such designations, and indeed of covenants like this one, is to ensure that our city's architectural heritage is not subject to the whims of fleeting tastes or the ambitions of a temporary owner. The covenant was designed to ensure stewardship passes to those with a vested, generational interest in the property's preservation." He looked directly at me. "Clara Hayes is a direct descendant of the original owner. She is also, by profession, a custodian of historic architecture. She is, in the court's view, precisely the kind of heir the covenant was designed to protect." Then, he turned his gaze to a still smirking Valerie. "Therefore, the court rules in favor of the plaintiff. The transfer of the property known as the Willows to Valerie Hayes, as stipulated in the will of Richard Hayes, is hereby declared null and void, superseded by the prior covenant on the original deed. Ownership of the mansion at 212 Chestnut Lane, and all its original, non-personal contents, is immediately and fully transferred to Clara Hayes." The gavel came down with a sharp, final crack. Valerie's smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, uncomprehending shock. Her lawyers were sputtering, already talking about an appeal. But Julian leaned over to me, a triumphant smile on his face. "It's over," he whispered. "Welcome home, Clara." The legal battle was won. Now it was time to reclaim my territory. The plan for the final reclamation was executed with the precision of a military operation. Julian Croft handled the legal logistics, obtaining an immediate writ of possession from the court. This gave me the legal authority to take control of the property without delay. An appeal from Valerie was inevitable, but Julian assured me her chances of overturning the ruling were minuscule, and in the meantime, the house was unequivocally mine. The final step was to be carried out by a court-appointed bailiff who would officially enforce the order. We chose our moment carefully. I knew from a disgruntled former housekeeper that Valerie had a standing Tuesday afternoon appointment at a ridiculously expensive salon, followed by a multi-hour shopping spree at a high-end department store. It was a ritual of self-indulgence she never missed. On that Tuesday at precisely 1:00 p.m., I met the bailiff and a locksmith at the gates of the Willows. The bailiff, a large, no-nonsense man named Mr. Henderson, presented the writ to the security guard at the gate, who, after a brief, panicked call to Valerie's lawyer, had no choice but to let us through. The locksmith made quick work of the front door. The sound of the drill was, to my ears, the sweetest music I had ever heard. The locks were changed, and a new set of keys was placed in my trembling hand. I stepped across the threshold of my own home for the first time as its rightful owner. The house was in an even worse state than I had remembered. Half-finished renovations were everywhere. Plastic sheeting covered the floors, and the air smelled of paint and plaster. But beneath the mess, the soul of the house was still there, waiting. As per the court order, I was entitled to all of the home's original contents: the furniture, the art, the books that had belonged to my family for generations. Valerie's personal belongings were another matter. I had hired a team of professional, bonded movers. They worked with a quiet, respectful efficiency, carefully packing all of Valerie's clothes, her modern furniture, her personal effects into boxes. They were instructed to be meticulous, to leave no room for a claim of damage. By 4:00 p.m., the house was purged of her presence. The boxes containing her life were neatly stacked on the curb, just outside the property line, as stipulated by the law. The final touch was a certified copy of the court order, which the bailiff taped securely to the new front door. At 4:30 p.m., I took my position. I sat on the top step of the porch, in the same spot my mother used to sit to watch the sunset, and I waited. I didn't have to wait long. At 5 o'clock, a gleaming sports car, a recent and extravagant purchase of Valerie's, purred up the long driveway. Valerie glided out of the driver's seat, her arms laden with shopping bags from a series of expensive boutiques. She was humming, a picture of carefree opulence. She walked toward the front porch, her high heels clicking on the stone walkway. She was halfway to the door before she finally saw them, the neat, formidable stack of cardboard boxes lining the curb. Her humming stopped. A look of confusion crossed her face. She quickened her pace, her eyes darting from the boxes to the front door. She saw the official notice taped to the wood. Her confusion hardened into disbelief. She fumbled in her designer handbag for her keys, her hands shaking slightly. She tried her key in the new lock. It didn't fit. She tried again, rattling it with increasing frustration. It was only then, in her frantic, panicked state, that she finally looked up and saw me, sitting calmly on the top step, watching her. "Clara," she breathed, her voice a mixture of shock and fury. "What is the meaning of this?" "What have you done?" I didn't stand up. I simply held up my own new key. "The locks have been changed," I said, my voice even and calm. "This is no longer your house, Valerie." "That's ridiculous," she shrieked, her carefully composed facade finally shattering. "The judge and my lawyers are appealing. You can't just throw me out." "The appeal is your right," I said, standing up slowly and walking to the edge of the porch, looking down at her. "But the ruling is the law. And as of this morning, the law says this house, and everything in it that belonged to my family, is mine. The court order is on the door if you'd like to read it." She stared at me, her face pale, the shopping bags dropping from her hands and spilling their expensive contents onto the ground. She looked from my face to the boxes on the curb, her entire life, neatly packaged and discarded. "My things," she stammered. "You can't just put my things on the street." "They are on the curb, which is public property," I recited, quoting the bailiff's instructions. "I would suggest you arrange to have them moved. Soon." She looked around, utterly defeated. The grand mansion loomed behind me, a silent stone sentinel that had chosen its side. The life of luxury she had schemed and manipulated for had evaporated in a single afternoon. She had inherited my father's liquid assets, of course, but I knew from the financial disclosures in the lawsuit that her extravagant spending had already depleted a significant portion of that fortune. She had won a battle, but she had lost the war. "You won't get away with this," she whispered, her voice trembling with a pathetic, impotent rage. I simply looked at her, at the woman who had poisoned my father's mind and tried to erase me from my own history. I felt no pity. I felt no triumph. I just felt a profound, quiet sense of order being restored. "I already have," I said. Then I turned, walked back into my house, and closed the door, leaving her alone with the ruins of her gilded life. The silence that greeted me inside the house was absolute. It was the sound of victory, but it was a lonely, echoing sound. The air was still thick with the chemical smell of Valerie's renovations, a lingering, toxic perfume. The grand foyer was a chaotic mess of plastic sheeting and discarded building materials. The chrome and glass banister de-installed was a garish wound in the heart of my home. My homecoming was not a triumphant return to a cherished sanctuary, but the beginning of an immense, daunting project. The work of restoration had to begin. My first call was not to a decorator, but to a team of artisans and restoration specialists, craftsmen I had worked with on professional projects who understood the soul of historic buildings. The first to go was the banister. Watching the workmen carefully dismantle the cold, sterile structure and prepare the way for a historically accurate recreation of the original was a deeply cathartic experience. It was the first step in healing the wounds the house had suffered. The following weeks were a blur of hard work. I oversaw every detail, from the painstaking chemical process of stripping the modern paint from the dining room murals to the sourcing of reclaimed, century-old mahogany to rebuild the library shelves Valerie had torn out. I was not just renovating, I was resurrecting. With every restored detail, I felt the spirit of the house, and my own, beginning to heal. I learned through Julian Croft that Valerie's appeal had been swiftly denied. Her legal options were exhausted. She had taken the remainder of her inheritance and moved away, to a resort town in another state, I heard. She had vanished from my life as quickly as she had appeared, a brief, destructive storm that had finally passed. One evening, after a long day of overseeing the restoration, I was alone in the house. I wandered into my mother's study, the one room that had remained untouched. The box of her sentimental items, the one my father's will had bequeathed me, was sitting on her old desk. I opened it. Inside were her journals, her photo albums, her favorite books of poetry. This, I realized, was the true inheritance my father had intended for me. The will had been Valerie's words, but this small, simple bequest had been his. It was his way of giving me the one thing that truly mattered: our memories, our history, our love. Sitting there in the quiet of my mother's room, surrounded by the ghosts of my family's past, I finally wept. I wept for my father, for the good man he had been before grief had broken him. I wept for the mother I missed every day. And I wept for the profound, complicated joy of being home. The Willows was more than just a house. It was my legacy, my responsibility, my heart. Reclaiming it had been a battle. Restoring it would be my life's greatest work, and I was ready to begin. The restoration of the Willows became my full-time obsession, a project that consumed my days and filled my dreams. It was a slow, meticulous process, the architectural equivalent of healing a deep wound. Each decision, from the precise mix of the plaster to the color of the silk damask on the drawing room walls, was a conversation with the past, an effort to honor the original vision of my great-grandfather. As the layers of Valerie's gaudy modernism were peeled away, the true character of the house began to reemerge. The dining room murals, once hidden beneath a shroud of grayish paint, were brought back to life, their vibrant colors a testament to the home's enduring spirit. The new mahogany banister, a perfect replica of the original, curved its way up the staircase like a familiar, welcoming embrace. I found a profound peace in the work, a sense of purpose that transcended the simple act of renovation. I was not just rebuilding a house, I was rebuilding my connection to my family, to my history. I discovered old photographs tucked away in forgotten drawers, letters from my grandparents, even my father's childhood report cards. The house was giving up its secrets to me, rewarding my care with a deeper understanding of the people who had walked its halls. I decided not to live in the entire mansion alone. It was too vast, too full of echoes. I restored the grand, formal rooms on the ground floor and the master suites on the second, but I also began working on a new plan. I would convert a wing of the house into a small, curated museum, open to the public on a limited basis, dedicated to the city's architectural history, with the Willows as its centerpiece. I would also create a fellowship for young architects specializing in historic preservation, offering them a space to live and study within the mansion's walls. The house would not be a silent, private monument to my family's past, but a living, breathing institution dedicated to the future of preservation. It was a way to share my inheritance, to transform a personal victory into a public good. The Willows Center for Architectural Heritage opened its doors 2 years after I reclaimed the house. The opening was a quiet, tasteful affair, attended by academics, architects, and patrons of the arts. It was the antithesis of the gaudy parties Valerie had thrown. As I stood in the fully restored grand foyer, watching people admire the craftsmanship and history of my home, I felt a sense of fulfillment that was deeper and more lasting than any feeling of revenge. I had transformed a symbol of personal pain into a beacon of cultural preservation. The foundation I established in my parents' names, the Aliner and Richard Hayes Foundation, funded the fellowship program. The first group of young, brilliant architects moved in, their energy and passion breathing new life into the old rooms. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of creation, of learning, of a legacy being passed on. I kept a private apartment for myself in what used to be the servants' quarters, a cozy, comfortable space where I could live my own quiet life, while still being the guardian of the grander structure. It was the perfect balance. I was a part of the house, but not imprisoned by it. Occasionally, I would think of Valerie. I pictured her in her new life, in a modern condo in a sun-drenched town with no history, a life of fleeting pleasures and surface-level relationships. I did not pity her, nor did I hate her. She was simply irrelevant, a character from a closed chapter of my life. Her greed had been a catalyst, the abrasive force that had polished me into the person I had become. She had tried to take my home, and in doing so, had shown me the true meaning of what a home is. It is not a collection of walls and possessions. It is a legacy of care, a responsibility to the past, and a gift to the future. My life found a new, fulfilling rhythm. I divided my time between my own architectural practice and my work with the foundation. The willows became my anchor, a constant source of inspiration and peace. The pain of my father's final years and the cruelty of his will faded, replaced by the older, happier memories the house held. I chose to remember him as the man who taught me to appreciate the beauty of a well-designed arch, not the man who had been blinded by a grief I could now, with the wisdom of age, begin to understand. I had not just reclaimed a house. I had reclaimed my father's memory from Valerie's destructive influence. One day, a young girl, visiting the museum with her school group, asked me, "Did you grow up here, in this actual house?" "I did," I said, smiling. "Was it like living in a castle?" She asked, her eyes wide with wonder. I thought for a moment, looking up at the grand staircase at the light streaming through the original stained glass windows. "Yes," I said. "It was, and it still is." The truest victory was not in the courtroom, nor on the day I closed the door on Valerie. It was in these small, quiet moments, the moments I was able to share the magic of my home with others, the moments I knew that the Hayes family legacy was not only safe, but was now a gift to the world. My name is Clara Hayes. I am an architect, a preservationist, and a steward. I lost my home, and in fighting for it, I discovered the true meaning of legacy. It is not something you inherit. It is something you build, you protect, and you pass on. The Willows was my inheritance, but the work of honoring it became my life's greatest design. And it is a design that will stand the test of time. The foundation and the center became my life's work, a legacy far grander than simply inheriting a private residence. I had transformed a personal, painful story of family betrayal into a public story of cultural preservation and educational opportunity. The house had been saved, but more than that, its purpose had been elevated. It was no longer just a home for one family, but a home for history itself. This, I felt, was a tribute my mother, the quiet librarian and lover of history, would have deeply appreciated. I had taken the most painful chapter of my life and turned it into a lasting institution of learning and beauty. It was the ultimate act of restoration. I learned that the strongest structures are not those that are immune to damage, but those that can be lovingly and meticulously restored after the storm has passed. My family had been damaged, my home had been desecrated, and my heart had been broken. But through a slow, deliberate process of fighting for the truth and honoring the past, I had managed to rebuild it all, stronger and more beautiful than before. The Willows stood as a testament to that resilience, its stone walls a symbol of enduring strength, its restored rooms a map of my own healing. And that was a legacy of which my ancestors, and I, could be proud. The final piece of the restoration was not architectural, but personal. Years later, I found a small, beautifully carved wooden box in a hidden compartment of my father's old desk. Inside was a single, yellowed photograph of my mother and him on their wedding day, looking young and full of hope. Tucked behind it was a short, handwritten note in my father's familiar scrawl. "For Clara," it read. "Never forget the foundation upon which this family was built. It is stronger than any storm." The note was undated, but I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that he had written it long before Valerie, long before his illness. It was a message from the father I had known and loved, a final, secret bequest of his true feelings. He had not forgotten me. In the end, his love was the foundation that had held firm all along. And with that final, quiet discovery, the restoration of my heart was complete.